Workshop 2. Workshop 2. Workshop 2.
Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you here this morning. Thank you to our generous hosts, the Kingdom of Norway. And a warm welcome to our session. It is the relevance of DPGs for advancing regional DPI approaches here in Workshop Room 2. And thank you to all of you joining online as well, wherever in the world you are, and in person for being here bright-eyed and bushy-tailed in our first session on the second day. So my name is John Lloyd. I'm the Director of Advocacy and 50M5 at the Digital Public Goods Alliance Secretariat. We're delighted to have such a diverse group of participants, both in person and online, contributing to this crucial discussion. Your varied perspectives are going to be vital in the session as well as we delve into the evolving landscape of digital public infrastructure, also known as DPI, and digital public goods, which are also known as DPGs. Before we get going too far, though, I just wanted to introduce the 50M5 campaign. It's one of the ways that the Global Digital Compact is being put into action with the goal of having 50 countries collaborating on DPI, sharing learnings and best practices, and also technologies as digital public goods. It's just over a year and a half into the campaign now, and in the spirit of this session, I'm very excited to announce that Kazakhstan is formally participating in the campaign as the 26th 50M5 country. We're absolutely thrilled to share their commitment to implementing safe and inclusive DPI alongside their fellow 50M5 countries, including France, represented here on stage with us today. So, back to our topic and introducing our panelists. Here we go. This topic is especially timely and relevant as we consider last year's Global Digital Compact. In the GDC, countries have committed to implementing digital public infrastructure with safety and inclusion at its core, as well as committing to collaborate and cooperate with one another through sharing lessons and best practices. They've also committed to developing, implementing, funding, and sharing technologies as digital public goods. That's open source software, open data, open AI models, and open content collections that adhere to privacy and other applicable laws and best practices, do no harm, and help attain their sustainable development goals. So what this means in practice is that countries can freely adopt digital public goods and use them to build components of safe, inclusive, and interoperable DPI according to their own priorities and context-specific needs. Just before I introduce our panel, I also want to introduce our fantastic team helping facilitate the session. Joining as our online moderator here is Pelin, and serving as our rapporteur today is Max. They are both my colleagues here at the Digital Public Goods Alliance. So thank you to the two of you. We're incredibly fortunate to have a distinguished panel of speakers with us today who'll be sharing their valuable insights. So online we have Desire Kachenje from Co-Develop. Next to me here is Rahul Matan from Trilegal, Henri Verdier from France, and Renata Avila from the Open Knowledge Foundation. So our objective for the next 75 minutes is clear. We want to explore different regional approaches to scaling DPI, co-evolve some forward-looking approaches to collaboration around digital public goods, and address the critical aspects of sovereignty and local agency in tech development. So for our remote participants, you'll be able to use our virtual platform's Q&A feature for questions, the chat for quick comments and reactions, and that is how we'll be obtaining your questions. on site here, please just feel free to actively participate in the discussion using microphones at the side. Okay, so thank you again for being here. Let's make this a truly insightful and collaborative session. And without further ado, over to you, Desire.
Thank you so much. I will start by introducing myself. So I am very honored to be here. My name is Desire Kachenje. I'm based in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. I am a senior principal. I look after investments in particularly Africa for Core Develop Fund. So just really quickly, I'm sure a lot of our ecosystem here has heard about us, but Core Develop is an investment fund, a nonprofit investment fund that focuses on supporting specifically governments, but also other stakeholders in rolling out digital public infrastructure. Our focus also expands to sort of like supporting in some of the challenges and bottlenecks, but also doing some research to understand a little bit more what digital public infrastructure looks like, but also the different approaches when it comes to deploying. And we work very closely with DPGs to see how they can make this sustainable. John, I don't know if you want me to proceed.
Sure, yeah. We'd love to hear some context-setting remarks about the from the African perspective.
Great. So I think one of the key things that a lot of us are hearing and what we're seeing in the continent is that digital public infrastructure is not just infrastructure. There are a number of other things that need to be considered when we want to roll out sustainable and scalable DPI. It's also evolving to be not just a digital transformation initiative, but also sort of like a growth within the ecosystem to inspire innovation, but also to bring in private sector and other players. So there are three key things that we're seeing in the African region that I want to talk about. So the first one would be it being very government driven, but ecosystem enabled. So I can give a good example here with Tanzania, where I'm based. Over the past few years, even before the concept around digital public infrastructure was formed and some of the research around it had been done, Tanzania has been building different layers of DPI. So they started working on the ID like most countries, and then they started building an interoperable digital payment system, starting with connecting mobile operators separately and then connecting banks and then thinking, how can we build a platform that connects these two? In their first exploration on how this payment platform would be, they did work with a DPG, and they then decided to roll out an in-house platform that was and is still managed by the government. Currently, right now, Tanzania is exploring a very interesting, I would say, a very interesting implementation plan, whereby while it's government driven, they're now rolling out what they're calling the Jamii data exchange platform. So this is the third layer of their DPI. And as they're doing this, they are not only working with local implementers within Tanzania, but they're bringing in different DPGs. Their data exchange platform is built on Xrod, so they're working closely with Xrod, but we are also working with them as Core Develop to build out what they're calling a Jamii wallet, which is a use case on top of this data exchange platform. And they're doing this using DigiLocker, which is a different type of DPG. At the same time, they're working closely with private sector to see how these platforms can interact, not just with government institutions, but also interact with private sector institutions and allow data exchange. So that's why I'm saying government driven, but very much ecosystem enabled. Another example is also around challenge driven DPI. A lot of digital public infrastructure platforms that have been rolled out so far, we are seeing a little bit of slowness when it comes to adoption. And we all know, like, even if it's interoperable, even if it's safe, if there is an adoption, and that means there's no engagement with citizens, there's no engagement with government institutions that need to use it, it cannot meet some of the potential that we see when it comes to DPI. So we are seeing, though, the DPI platforms that are being rolled out that start with a challenge are not only more innovative and more customer citizen focused, but they also have more adoption from the point of rollout. I'll give a good example in the SADC region right now. So SADC region is the Southern Africa sub-Saharan countries. There are about 16 of them who are currently in the SADC group. And one of the questions or challenges that came up is there's a lot of immigrants that are moving between these countries. And while a lot of these immigrants might have a national ID and other documents, they're still not in the formal. The question then became why, and the quick answer was some of them just don't have documents. for example, Zimbabwean, and I'm now working in South Africa, but I don't have the right documents in South Africa to support me to be formally included in financial services. But then at the same time, we know that a lot of these countries already have national IDs. They already have national digital IDs. So then the SADC group had reached out to us and another partner within South Africa called Finmark Trust to figure out, hey, can we build a use case that actually connects the national foundational IDs that are existing within these countries to be able to support migrants to use formal financial services within Africa. So, and we've seen the quick stakeholder engagement in this project. We already have private sector. These are the banks joining in. We already have the central banks who are paying attention to the project and seeing how they can come in. And then last but not least, innovation needs to meet sovereignty. So that's the other bit that I'm sure we'll be exploring a lot more today. But there's always a question around when we're building DPI, especially specifically when we're building DPI with DPGs, how do we ensure that countries have the local ecosystem to not only own, but run, maintain, and develop new use cases? I think a good example is in Rwanda right now, where they're rolling out a number of use cases when it comes to DPI. And what they're also doing on the side is they're now deploying, or they're building up what they're calling a center, a DPI center. And this DPI center is supposed to support ecosystem players, including developers, whether they're in government or they're private sector, and seeing in what ways they can be able to understand, build capacity for them to understand the use cases and how they can support in aspects of maintaining some of the use cases that will be rolled out in the few years. So I think that gives a bit of an example of how DPI has been rolled out in Africa. And if I'm happy to explore this a little bit more. One thing I would mention is that there's also challenges which I think are globally, and we're seeing it very in real time in Africa. And these are mainly to do with safeguards. So one of them that I can mention is around data governance. So when we're building these data exchange platforms, especially when they're regional, bringing more than one country, we have very fragmented digital data governance frameworks that are existing. So this moves beyond just the platform itself, but how do we bring policymakers? How do we enable countries to harmonize some of the policies that are in place to ensure that the platforms that have been built are safe and inclusive? So I will hand over back to you, John, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Desire. That was a really excellent insight into how Africa is approaching DPI development, especially using DPGs. Rahul, we'll move over to you now, and we've heard so much about the India stack, and I would like to just hear more about how India has approached its DPI development and its approach to DPGs as well.
Thank you, John. So I almost feel I must apologize for India stack, because we started this idea of a stack which leaves the impression that you must necessarily layer first identity, then payments, and then data sharing. And really, it's not mandatory that you have to do it in that way. So even though we sort of think about stack and the stack approach as a pathway by which you must progress up the chain of DPIs, I'm here to say that the real idea of a stack is that we are creating modular elements, DPGs, that can be layered on top of each other in whichever order you want, for whichever solution you want. And that really is the stack approach that India has followed. Now, India happened to start with identity and then built a very powerful payment system, which is currently doing 18 billion transactions a month, and then has built data sharing. But if you think sideways, India has built DigiLocker, which is a very powerful credential system. And credentials are very useful for a number of things, from skilling to government-to-person payment solutions to all sorts of things. And so the real India approach, I would say, is leaning into some of the definition of what DPI is, which is open, interoperable, modular systems. And you can start wherever you want on the stack. You don't necessarily have to have an digital identity system. It'll help if you have one, but you don't necessarily have to have one. But you have to build these solutions to be modular, interoperable, and open. Because it's only if you build them to be modular, interoperable, and open that you can really reach population scale because you never have to rebuild something that you have built previously. And that is a really powerful statement of how digitalization needs to happen. Now, India's, of course, as you know, been doing this for 15 years. So if you do it for a decade and a half, you have some time for introspection, and you can go back and see what is this thing that you've built. And once you've figured out that you've built something which is pretty cool, you can then go and see what else it can be used for. And one of the things that I've been playing with is this idea that is some of the things that Desire was talking about, that we've got to really sort out data governance, because at the end of it all, we are unlocking a lot of data, and we need to do it in a safe manner. And so how do you do it? The traditional lawyer in me says you've got to write laws, and you've got to build policies, and you've got to do it the way we've done it for many centuries. But the power of digital, and the power of digital where everything is digital, is that you can actually build some of that governance into the design of the architecture that you're using. Now, this is an idea that's not new. 25 years ago, Lawrence Lessig wrote a marvelous book called Code and the Other Laws of Cyberspace, where he said that on the internet, code is law. Now, at that point in time, the internet was a thin sliver of what we all do. Today, the internet and digital is everything that we do. I'm here in Norway, and I don't need to take out my wallet, which is remarkable, because in many cities, even in Europe, you have to. And I can travel around from Oslo to Lillestrøm using just the app, know which train is coming. When the train is cancelled on me, I can very easily get the other train. It's remarkable that you can do all of this using an entirely end-to-end digital system. But when we do that, we've got to remember that that same digital system gives us the tools to actually inbuild governance directly into the interactions that we have. This, to me, is the hidden secret of digital public infrastructure. Because digital public infrastructure really is an infrastructure layer that you have created for transactions. Laws are the offline way of telling us how transactions need to be conducted. And in an entirely online world, the laws that tell you how to transact can actually be written directly into the ways in which these different modules interact with each other. And so the term that I coined, the sort of phrase I coined is that we're building an infrastructure on which regulators can regulate and innovators can innovate. And this is different from the other infrastructures that are built by innovators, on which only innovation can happen on the terms of the people who control the platforms. And then regulators are forced to use the traditional old world ways of coming up and saying laws, etc. But if the regulators can also participate as regulators on that infrastructure, they will be able to set the rules, and the innovators will be able to innovate on the same platform. And that really, I think, is the secret hidden message of digital public infrastructure.
It's very interesting, especially given India has been a real leader in the DPI space. And a real example that a lot of countries are looking to. And Henri, maybe we can move to you now. And we've heard a lot about this idea of the Eurostack, we know it's several different things, but I would like to hear more about the European approaches to digital sovereignty, the role of open source in that, and particular this concept of the digital commons and how that aligns with the digital public goods agenda.
Okay, so thank you for being there. That's a pleasure to exchange with my friends. So I was listening to the two first speakers. I feel that the perception of the DPI movement in Europe was immediate and very positive. Maybe because we have a long tradition and we love good specification. You know, Europe is the birthplace of, I don't know, the metric system, the ITU, and a lot of open standards, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, a lot of open source like Linux, etc. And we love when the world is properly organized. So these ideas that you can manage, plan, we love it. And the second thing is that there is probably an ideological alignment because we have a strong culture of public services. And maybe in the discussion we'll need to precise that public service is not government. So that's not exactly the same thing. And in France, the culture of the public servant is really strong, and they don't consider that they are there to obey to the minister. They have a service to deliver, and they do it. Probably a third connection is the idea that when we see the digital world as we see it, if we want to protect an open, free, decentralized, vibrant internet, and to protect democracy, the right to the people to decide their collective future together, and to impose some solution, we need this layer of DPI to implement some political decision and collective decision on the open internet. So I think that we are ideologically aligned, but because the need to change was not the same, we didn't go as fast as India, for example. I say very often in Bangalore, I use UPI in Bangalore, but in France you can buy a baguette with a contactless payment with your phone without any fee for decades. But that's a very old and imperfect system. You need a bank account, a credit card, an emulation of the credit card, a connection. So that's a very complex system, but you can do it, and that's quite free. So the need to change was not the same until the growing concern regarding sovereignty. So France was probably the most concerned with sovereignty forever, because we are a bit Gaullist, so we say we decide, we want strategic autonomy. I have to say that a lot of other Europeans were a bit less concerned. And then we have this movement, which is not just the Trump administration. We have also companies that becomes very, very big and heavy and start to act as political actors. So when you see, of course, the most obvious is Elon Musk, but you can, if you see carefully, you can see others. They want to decide the future of the world, of geopolitics and national politics, as to Brazil, what Musk tried to do. So we have a growing concern, and to be frank, we are really, really, really heavily dependent and vulnerable to American companies and American infrastructure everywhere. Do you remember last month, the American government decided to cut the email of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court? That's something impressive. So because of this, we are progressing toward, slowly but firmly, toward a kind of digital public infrastructure with all this culture of good organization and public service. And for example, next year we'll have the EU digital wallet, which is a very important step, because we will have the same standard in all the European citizens' phone to present and interact with digital ID. And we've learned to separate some attributes from the ID. So, for example, I will be able to prove that I am more than 18 years old without giving my name, which is very promising for a lot of issues. And now I'm going in the last 30 seconds toward public good and open source. But we are still European, and we are still 27 countries. And so when you say to any European country, let's build a common EU stack, they will say, all of them will say, of course, let's take my solution. Let's take X-Road, let's take France Connect, let's take... and probably we've lost 10 years because of this, because of a kind of competition between national solutions. And now we are learning, thanks to the open source movement, to build buckets of interoperable solutions. For example, there is a Franco-German project, La Suite Numérique, that's the desk for the public servants. This is not one solution. This is a series of modules, and you can add your own module. The group will test if this is interoperable with the others. The group will develop the interoperability if needed, and we will have. I finished to say that the only way, from my perspective, for a real EU stack is not one stack, is a variety of solutions, and all together we pay attention and we build interoperability. And the EU stack will be a a cloud of nebuleuse, we say in French, of solutions, you will be able to decide, I take Matrix or I take another one, but I know that when I do enter in this world, I can interact with all the others. And we are progressing fast. From 1 year, more or less, things are accelerated. And this is deeply connected to the DPG movement, because for this, we need all those communities of open source, open standards, developers, small companies, associations, etc.
Excellent. Thank you, Henri. I think, you've touched on especially those issues around, I guess, the sovereignty issue, which is coming up. Desire and Rahul have both kind of covered that in their introductions as well. And Renata, let's move to you, and I'd like to hear more from the Latin American perspective as well about how countries in LAC are approaching DPI as well.
Yes, I think that it really connects well with the last bit of Henry, because I think that the emphasis in Latin America is communities. And it is very interesting because we start early. The vision of digital public infrastructure was being discussed in Latin America early 2000s. And an example of that is that 7 countries in Latin America have legislation for open source and open content. So those 2 pillars, it is not words, but actions in many countries in Latin America. I can list it: Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, Venezuela, Uruguay, and Cuba. And I will say that the first thing that the Latin American countries understood together with code is law is that technology is politics. And we learned the hard way, after some sanctions to some countries in Latin America, of course, you're cut off vital things that you need to do your work. And that accelerated in the early 2000s a transition, when Latin American countries were adopting some policies that were not welcome, but the main provider of technology had to move. The open source was the way, and the interesting thing is it was institutionalized. There were units inside ministers in charge of this, and there were resources allocated to that. But in parallel, and it's something that is very important because that didn't last long. The institutionality after transitions and left, right, as it is in our very vital democracies. And many, was discarded or defunded. But what it stayed was the community component. And that's the highlight of the continent. The communities around open source, the communities around free software, the communities around open content are very active. And it's very interesting. You see in Europe, a lot of funding for community works and digital social innovation and so on. It's not enough, but compared to Latin America. In Latin America, it's the volunteer, it's what you do after work. It was what you do on weekends. You edit a Wikipedia article, you code and contribute to a collaborative platform. And so what I will say, that what it is different is that in Latin America, we are very good at the digital public goods, but we haven't jumped yet to the big digital public infrastructure plans, except some specific cases. One case that is very exciting is the case of PIX in Brazil. And it even made it to Europe, I am at the moment living partially in Portugal. And I was in Lisbon, and I saw PIX. I could pay by PIX in Portugal. Brazilians can pay with PIX in Portugal. Imagine that, it's very interesting. And it is being adopted in Panama, Peru, Bolivia, Paraguay, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Argentina is doing a pilot. And it makes sense because Brazil is, half of our continent. So all the border countries are making easy to exchange. We are not Europe. We don't have the euro. It's difficult. It's frictions with currencies and a lot of very complicated legislation because of money laundering and so on. So this is making a real difference. And the other thing that I want to highlight, this the ugly dog, nobody speaks in an exciting way about it, is the geospatial infrastructure. Most of Latin America share geospatial infrastructure, which is that is a digital public good, and that's amazing. That really enables the work of many, many public offices. And on the other highlight is data. CCAN, which Open Knowledge Foundation coded initially and now is one of the default platforms in more than 20 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And DCAN as well, and so the civic and the CDIM also is many of the Latin American participatory platforms, and many other smaller civic tech projects follow the logic and are already listed as digital public goods. But one thing that before I do not want to forget, because it connects to India, is an emergent trend of South-South cooperation, which is very, very exciting in the frame of BRICS and CARICOM. India's stack has signed MOUs with Cuba, Colombia, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago, Antigua and Barbuda, and Barbados. And that's a sub-region, practically, the Caribbean and Colombia. Colombia is the only one in the mainland. But it is very, very exciting to see how all of this connects. The Caribbean community is also super strong in communities of open source. And so what I will say that is the highlight of the region is that it's a region that can make, what will be different is that it's not only the techies and the regulators, but it's the community ready to take active, informed participation in how you build your digital public infrastructure. And so those are the exciting news from the region.
Great, thank you so much. And we're going to jump in now to a real question and answer component of this. We'd really like to have your feedback and questions, particularly online. Make sure that you're submitting those. We've heard a lot of common threads coming through here and common use cases in particular. I think one compelling thing that's coming out is this idea of the cross-border use cases, which I don't necessarily think that countries are considering when they're implementing their own DPI, but the importance of interoperability in the solutions is becoming more and more prominent. You mentioned it with PICs, funnily enough, that you can now use in Europe. And of course, Desire covered that as well with just being able to access financial services using your digital ID. And so, but Rahul, maybe I can jump to you quickly, but what do you think are some of the big differences between the way that India has been approaching its DPI development and what you've been hearing from the other speakers?
So, look, I don't think there's much that's different. I think, we came from a different place. As Henri said, to India, and I think this is true of a lot of the global south, this is the only way to leapfrog development so that we can, I think the statistics are, do in 10 years what would have otherwise taken us 50 years. And I think a lot of countries are seeing that. Now, France didn't need to do that because France had already put the 50 years in and they were sort of 50 years ahead. And for the rest of the developed world, this is not in that sense a necessity for many of the traditional elements of the stack. And I think, digital identity, if you've got a very strong civil registry, you don't really need to do what India did and get biometrics to the whole population. You just rely on your civil registry. If you've got a working payment system that reaches everyone in the country, you don't need to go and build a PIX because already there's a way in which to do it. But for the countries of the global south, where they're seeing that there's a lot that we have to achieve, this is a quick way to do it. Now, just to touch on the interoperability across borders, India, as you know, is a subcontinent. And so in many ways, of course, there is a need to interoperate with other countries, but we are a billion people, and we really need to focus first on interoperating inside and reaching everyone in the country, which is what the identity system did. Unfortunately, the payment system, as big as it is only covering maybe 300 to 400 million people. We have 1 billion left to cover. So we have a long road ahead of us, even within the country. But I think there are many other elements where we can and must cooperate. I'm going to put a plug for climate because using digital public infrastructure to solve the climate crisis is probably the most important, urgent innovation that we can think of as the next step of digital public infrastructure. You may think, as I'm saying this, you may say, what is he talking about? But let's just agree, this is 10 years from the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement isn't really working. Temperatures are rising beyond the point where I think we can scale it back to our climate objectives. The approach of building grand consensus between countries is not working because countries are not committing and people are walking out of the agreement. We've got to find a different way. And the one thing about DPI is DPI unlocks abundance. We are stuck with data and valuable opportunity in silos that don't connect to each other. And if we can just rethink the way in which we address climate challenges by connecting our silos, we will find that solving the climate problem does not cost the trillions of dollars that it's estimated to cost, because that is an old world way of thinking of solutions. And I strongly urge all of us here, I mean, COP is in Brazil this year, and I strongly urge all of us to rethink the way we go about this, because DPI has shown a way for very, very big challenges like financial inclusion. I see no reason why that can't be applied to something as important as climate change.
And Renata, I'll jump to you because you mentioned this a little bit when you were speaking earlier, but Latin Americans are sharing geospatial data, I think, in terms of addressing that climate using digital public goods. How have they been built and governed in a way that's enabling this cooperation and collaboration?
Well, I think that the GeoSur project, I don't know the details of the governance, but it is usually cooperation across the region is very dynamic and fluid, especially in two issues, in cross-border cooperation and in health issues. I think that the pandemic, PAHO, for example, has played a key. There's regional mechanisms that have enabled this cooperation. I think that also two actors have played a crucial role, and one is the Inter-American Development Bank, and the other is, the regional mechanisms such as CELAC and OAS to make countries agree on general frameworks. Of course, not at the level of coordination of Europe, but close to that. I think that also the lack of tailored solutions and the lack of prioritization by the global north of solutions specific to Latin America had accelerated that in the geospatial area. And one more that is very important, it has also, Latin America has been one of the pioneers together with India actually in opening also knowledge and opening research that will be like key. It's a combination of data, knowledge, and infrastructure that makes the region very ripe for more ambitious efforts around climate.
Excellent. And speaking about regional ambitions, desire, we've heard a lot, especially from the East Africa community recently. We know that there are commitments being made on this idea of cooperation and collaboration. So there's a lot of political will there. And that's a thread that I've kind of heard coming through as well. But is there also a risk through moving too fast and not necessarily taking a multi-stakeholder approach, and the effects that might have on inclusion or exclusion of people in terms of being able to access services?
Thank you. Great question. So I think the way you've put it is actually very correct. There's a lot of political will. And this is more specifically, I would say, when it comes to digital payments, even like with the East African community, it's mostly around digital payments and how we can, connect some of this digital infrastructure that's existing. So right now, just for context, it's worthwhile to understand that in Africa, DPI is looked at mainly to kind of solve some of the fragmentation issues, but also to bring together inclusion. So like to solve for the digital divide. And digital payments took off more, I think, in Africa region than, in most other parts of the world, because it came from a need, a necessity that a lot of African citizens want to send small amounts of money to rural areas that probably don't have network and don't have internet. And that caused, mobile banking to skyrocket, etc. And then from there, it was now easy to create interoperability because it was very clear the use case that needs to be there. Now, I think to answer your question, there are two risks that a lot of countries are looking at and a lot of regional operators are looking at. We already have PASS, which is the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System. We have TCIB for the southern region, and there are a number of others that are coming up. But one of the bigger questions has been, there is a lot of smaller amounts that are being shared across these countries. And the platforms, while the interoperability is there, they are not really accommodating such amounts. And so some of the work that is being done, and I think I want to give, more like a congratulations to some of the DPGs in DPI right now who are focusing on working with some of those regional organizations, for example, COMESA, to say, hey, can we have a use case that just focuses on something like merchant payments, where these are your smaller payments, and to enable smaller SMEs, so SMEs, or to smaller amounts to be sent in the region. So this is really helping when it comes to inclusion. An example of this is that COMESA is currently working with Moduloop, which is a DPG for payment platforms, and they're doing a trade, a platform whereby it will allow smaller traders to send smaller amounts of money within the region. The other bit I think we've mentioned, it comes to that there is a lot of legacy systems that are existing in Africa currently. And a lot of these legacy systems, it's been hard to then transition them to actual platforms. And then it's even harder to transition them in a way that we're using the DPI approach, making them interoperable, making them open. And we are seeing right now that DPGs is taking, a lot of countries are taking a different look at DPGs and they're more open, although we're also seeing specific requests that, fine, let's use an open source platform, but can we have the data being on-prem, so being on the ground, which then brings a lot of questions around, how do we manage this? How do we incorporate this? So I would say when it comes to inclusion, it's usually to look after the low income populations and the harder to reach populations. And the other bit is then how do we ensure that, a lot of the governments are comfortable in some of the open systems as they are built, and spending more time in trying to customize them specifically for one country, because then now when we're trying to connect regionally, we have to do more customization, which can be quite expensive and time consuming. Yeah.
Interesting. And Henri, I'm going to ask you a question a little bit about some of this regulation. We've heard the Silicon Valley approach of move fast and break things. Unfortunately, it seems like they've broken too much, perhaps. But I think in Europe, given that often the rest of the world will look to Europe in terms of tech regulation, things like the DSA, the AI Act, all of that kind of thing. But what we're hearing here is that with DPGs and for DPI, there needs to be a lot of flexibility and openness in the approach. But in terms of, I guess, from this European or French perspective, what are some of the non-negotiable elements that need to be in place? I guess from your perspective, in order to maintain that sense of innovation and collaboration, but need to, I guess, set the box in order for us to all play in.
Very interesting questions. I'm building an answer. Yes, obviously there are non-negotiable elements, and that are all the decision of free democracies. So privacy, human dignity, free speech, as we consider that free speech should be. So it doesn't allow you to ask to kill people online, etc., etc. And if we cannot implement our collective decision, we are not a democracy anymore. And that's why sovereignty matters, because sovereignty, you cannot conceive a democracy without sovereignty. You can conceive sovereignty without democracy, but you cannot conceive democracy without sovereignty. So first, second observation, starting from the Indian, I will take the Indian vocabulary. You cannot regulate just with law. You need a techno-legal approach. By the way, you need champions if you're not creative, innovative, if you don't have research, intellectuals, creators, companies, startups, etc., you won't impose your views. So you have to be part of the movement, and you have to conceive a way to implement a bit the regulation. So that's why we need a longer conversation regarding rules as code. But yes, that's important to be sure that when you decide something, you know how to implement it. Interesting example, for years and years in Europe, we are very concerned by age verification because we know that very, very young children goes to pornographic websites, but I'm speaking about the age of 8. 10% of the children less than 8 years old are seeing pornographic content online. So, but if you just say, we want to check the age, it doesn't mean nothing. So the question is, how can we do this? And because we need to respect privacy, etc., the only solution is to have a proof of age separate from the identity. And for this, you need to conceive an infrastructure and that is efficient, auditable, because we need also to be sure that they are really separating those information, etc., etc. Because your question is about regulation is also politics, I just want to add one last word. I was asking to myself, what do we have in common? Because we are from 4 continents, and we have a lot in common. And I was thinking that something that we have in common is a bit hidden, because it's so obvious that we don't pay attention to this. In a nutshell, I think that we would all agree that a good society need equal access to some basic public services, need a kind of respect, need a democracy and a collective decision, need free speech and free innovation for the market, etc., etc. But this is not a real consensus. So we have this in common. This is not what most of the companies of the Valley thinks. And they are developing an infrastructure to capture our economies, to transform us into a kind of global Uber drivers economy within their platform, where they take all the added value. And if you pay attention, there is a real theory. Probably it started with Milton Friedman, but now they have more and more books. The network states was to be seen, because that's the program of Elon Musk. Let's replace the old-fashioned nation states with big vertical companies, one for education, one for... and that's the big front line and the big battle. Can we still empower the people through infrastructure and good governments to respect dignity and innovation and everything? Or do we have to let our lives within big corporations and their infrastructure? And that's maybe one of the secret connection between all those movements.
I'm just going to pause for a second here, and we're going to launch a Mentimeter poll.
So applaud.
So those of you online, there was applause in the room next to us, which we heard here. So there is a Mentimeter poll here. If you're able to join using this QR code or go to the link here in Menti, we'll launch that in just a second. I think people are still taking photos of the QR code. So it's just coming up now. Okay, let's launch that poll. We've heard a little bit about some of these challenges in DPI implementation from regional perspectives here, but in terms of scaling DPI globally, what do you think are the biggest challenges? And we can see some of the answers coming in now. All of us panelists are watching them come in.
Can we have multiple answers? Or?
It's the biggest challenge, Henri. If you had to choose just one. Yeah, these are quite interesting answers. I'll just I'll read out what the options are here. So we've got lack of interoperability, ensuring data privacy and security, addressing local capacity and agency, funding and resource allocation, and political will and governance. And it looks like we've got a bit of a dead heat here between 3 of these options. And I'll just open it up to our panelists. What are your reactions to seeing this, Renata?
You know, what I love is that everybody deprioritize funding and resource allocation, because we are now well aware of all the money spent in tech monopolies that deliver nothing and not even pay taxes in our countries. So I think that that's clear, that's consensus now. And when you were saying what we have in common, what we have in common is that we are, we are between we are squeezed without options, and we really need to work together, all the people here at this table, in reverting the lack of options and the heavy dependencies that we have in a system that is not delivering for democracy or for sovereignty. So and the second thing that it is very interesting in the results is also the need to address local capacity and agency, because very quickly, something that I am a part of is that most of the local capacity, most of the programs training civil servants are run by big tech from Silicon Valley. Most of it, like basically training our civil service just to think that they are the only solution available, and ignoring all this rich ecosystem of possibilities that we could take. So those are like my two comments.
Henri, you...
Very briefly this time. I'm the only one that did vote for economic allocation because of the word allocation. First, it was very difficult to choose because everything here was very important. But I feel that we need a better economic theory of the economic role of DPI. If we decided in Europe a century ago to make postal service or whatsoever as public services, it was because it did create so much value everywhere that it was quite impossible to take the value everywhere. And the tax is the best way to finance something that creates value everywhere. And we need such a theory for the modern version of public service that is DPI.
And do we still have Desire with us? I hope so. Because Desire, how are digital public goods addressing some of these issues around like funding and resource allocation, where Africa is a historically resource-constrained area still now? And what is the role of digital public goods in helping address that in terms of DPI development and launch?
Yes, so I think firstly, it's very interesting for me to see this because I agree. I really like that addressing local capacity is quite high up there. I think what we're seeing here, funding and resource allocation, is still quite a huge issue because a lot of these other issues, addressing local capacity, political will, and lack of interoperability for a lot of African, countries, they do need funding to sort of solve some of these issues. So I think there's a slight difference there in terms of the outlook here, and in terms of DPG, I would say it's a double-edged sword. So there's one side that a lot of DPGs already have easy to use source code that can be easily implemented within African countries. But then at the same time, a lot of DPGs still need to build local capacity within the countries that they're operating in, which then this requires time and resources and funding. So DPGs have done a great job in understanding the challenges and specific needs when it comes to different African countries and different, approaches to DPI. And I think DPGs are also putting their hand up in terms of coming up with easier ways or more efficient ways to roll out. But at the same time, there's also the other side that a lot of DPGs are funded. So sustainability around maintaining some of the DPGs long term for them internally itself is still something that needs to be discussed. But then when they are rolling out in African countries, the customization and the ability to remain sustainable past the project, especially because most of the project when it comes to DPIs that use DPGs are donor funded. So sustainability past that donor funded project is still a question. And then last but not least, John, I really want to touch on data privacy and security. And I know that, it's something that we're discussing on and on, but it's such a crucial issue, even when it comes to working with DPGs, because a lot of, let's say if we look at something like data, there are some countries that still do not have clearly defined, what does it look like when it comes to digital data for specific populations. Like when we're looking at children, what is data privacy for children, especially when it comes to things like digital IDs or digital birth registrations. So while we have a number of DPGs such as OpenCRVS, which are doing a great job when it comes to like registrations, but we're seeing a bit of a struggle here for countries to then adapt privacy and security issues, which kind of make a lot of projects halt in between, because then you will have CSOs coming in and saying, how safe is this? So I think that's my quick take.
Excellent. Yeah, that was extremely useful. We're going to launch a second Mentimeter question now, because it relates a lot to what Desai was just speaking about. So here we go. Hopefully you still have the Mentimeter link up from before, but which of these do you believe is most effective in ensuring countries build and evolve technologies based on their own priorities? So here's the Mentimeter link. If you lost it before, our options here, we've got open source first principles, decentralized DPG governance models, promoting digital commons, which I think relates to the European agenda here, local talent development and training to address some of those capacity issues, and then this idea of, I guess, international funding but with local control. So this is very interesting as well in terms of open source first principles. I know, Renata, you spoke about many countries in Latin America having this open source first approach. And seeing some of the answers changing here now as well.
Oh, God.
It's very interesting. Also, if there's anyone present with us who would like to ask a question, please feel free to come up and ask them at the microphones either side of the stage. We'd love to hear from you. Hey, Lynn, how are our answers coming in, questions from online? Well, we can take a look in a second. Yeah. Great. And Rahul, maybe as these results are coming in, what are your reflections about this?
I mean, it's interesting to see funding right at the bottom. I think this is repeating what we saw in the previous Mentimeter. And I think the idea really is that it doesn't take a lot of funding. It's not that funding is not important, but actually DPIs are a relatively cheap alternative to doing this. I think it's interesting to see local talent development right on top, because this is something that we sometimes don't really fully grok as to how important this is. You can build these wonderful platforms, but there is a last mile that needs to be implemented by government servants, NGOs, even ordinary citizens, and the development that's required in order to do that is actually non-trivial. And we can't automate everything away. As no matter what you do with digital, there's always that last mile. But even as I'm speaking, I'm seeing that we've got 3 tied for 3rd place, and it's clearly local talent and open source as the top 2, which in many ways really aligns with the way I think about these things. This is really the 2 most important things we should be thinking about.
And do you see the use of digital public goods in assisting with the local talent development and training, or
of
open
course.
source?
No, I mean, look, we can keep chipping away at the amount of physical or non-digital steps that we need to take to build this. And I think certainly in doing that, building DPG type training, talent development solutions using Sunbird and things like that are extraordinarily powerful. But I think that at least when I speak to DPI development in other countries, and not just in my country, I find that this is the thing that that governments are most concerned about. And it may just be fear of the unknown, but a lot of governments are concerned about how much it's going to take to actually really roll this out in countries. And I think that's certainly something that we can look to improve using DPG solutions, building DPIs even just for talent development. But we can't ignore the fact that this is a concern and that this is something that needs to be actively addressed.
Thank you. And we have a gentleman here with a question. If you could just start by introducing yourself and then, and if it's directed to the panel or anyone in particular.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Israel Rosas. I'm with the Internet Society, but this question is in my personal capacity. I've seen that the digital public infrastructure is broadly prominent in the Global Digital Compact, for instance. And now that we are discussing how to integrate the Global Digital Compact implementation into the WSIS plus 20 review process, I'm curious about the framing of decentralized governance models for DPI. What would be the panel's impression on, instead of just decentralized governance models, adopting a truly multi-stakeholder governance approach for DPI? Because I think that there are slight but important differences, so it would be interesting in hearing your thoughts. It's a broad question for the panel. Thank you.
I mean, look, I'm a huge fan of decentralized anything, but we've got to realize that we all need to cleave to a certain set of common principles. And so, once again, picking back on Henri's point, the concern with a lot of this is sovereignty. And one of the challenges with sovereignty is that if you're utterly decentralized, in the process of being completely decentralized and multi-stakeholder, you can lose some of the sovereignty requirements that you individually need. So to me, I like the Global Digital Compact. I'm part of the DPI safeguards framework, once again, all of which are saying, let's build some principles that we all agree with, and then let's leave it to countries to develop the bespoke governance frameworks that are appropriate for their context and what they want to achieve. And I think that that is the combination we need. As Henri said, what is common to all of us? There are many things that are common to all of us. We must absolutely adhere to those things, because that's the reason why we can all meet at places like this and exchange views in a language that we all understand. But at the same time, we've got to recognize that we as nations and as subnational institutions have our own objectives that we want to achieve. Some of those in India, in Africa, in Latin America are very different from what Europe and North America want to achieve and can achieve. It's not wrong. It's just that those are differences that we've got to recognize. And part of the way we recognize the difference is to also recognize the commonalities and say, as long as we're common, you can be different. And that is sort of maybe that's what you're trying to say, because multi-stakeholderism also is that. But I fear that we lose that if we make it not grounded on common principles. And I think the common principles are important.
If I can add one word, as Raoul said at the beginning, a stack, a EU stack or Indian stack, doesn't have to be a cathedral. It can be diverse and modular, etc. Some things are very regalian, we say in French, regalian. The source of citizenship is a state. You cannot crowdsource citizenship. But you can build important parts in a very multi-stakeholder approach and with a new form of cooperation for the state with civil society, with public goods. For example, in France, before being the ambassador, I was the head of the state, the IT department for the government. I did build a strong partnership between the National Geographical Institute and OpenStreetMap. And now we do deliver some important public services in cooperation between OpenStreetMap and the National Geographic Institute. Or we did build our own instant messaging system, CHAP, with Matrix, and we did just ask to Matrix to develop some features, and we did finance, and they did implement it as they want. So you can, for a lot of important parts of this, you can be completely multi-stakeholder in the governance and development, and for other parts, probably you cannot, because state has some roles and prerogatives.
Renata, yeah, of course.
Yes, I had this pressing need to. I wrote a paper precisely about that with some colleagues, and we suggest instead of multi-stakeholder approach, a commons-based governance approach for digital public infrastructure, and it more beyond the national uses is the only way that it will help scale and localize digital common efforts. It increases transparency and accountability, it accelerates impact, it reduces governance, data, and even localization frictions. And the most important thing, it secures community engagement. So even if the government changes, you have people actively involved in the governance of infrastructures that are of common benefit.
We have a question from the chat here that I will just address, and this is a lot to do with inclusion and specifically around access and design. I'm going to look to you because we've heard examples from digital public goods, for example, Mojaloop, which is a digital payment system. Many people access that on feature phones rather than smartphones. But with the question here is, with 2.6 billion people not using the internet, any comments on how to overcome the divide?
Yeah, I was actually just reading that same question and asking myself the same thing. I mean, I think what we have seen with a lot of this is not just for payment systems. Even when you're looking at something like ID, one of the key questions you would get from the African citizens, we were talking about this at ID for Africa a month ago, whereby a lot of citizens are asking the question, I don't have internet, why do I even need a digital ID, and what does that look like? And what, instead of that, can we focus on providing access such as internet to rural areas? So yes, it's a big question, and I think one of the things that I've seen a lot of specifically DPGs trying to address is to create other ways for access when it comes to some of the use cases that are being deployed. So like you mentioned, Modulo, they are providing access for future phones. If you look at other things such as data exchange platforms, there are some data exchange platforms that are built upon USSDs, which is something that's very common for a lot of African countries. But the governments have really tried, and some of the nations and some of the governments have really tried to create systems whereby all local communities have spaces within their proximity that have access to desktops and internets, and all of these digital platforms can be accessed there. So if you walk around some of the revenue authorities across African countries, they do have desktops and access points whereby you can still use the digital platform at their office using those platforms. So that is something that has been I think a lot of countries are trying to do. But I think Joseph is raising a very significant question that goes beyond just rolling out in use cases when it comes to DPI. The question is, the access to internet is still a prominent challenge when it comes to a lot of African countries, and I think other countries. I mean,
particularly
infrastructure. How do we?
Sorry, you just broke up there, and I think that illustrates this point a little bit in terms of access. Yeah, and sorry, we've only got a little bit of time left. Thank you, Desire. Just one final question before we continue, which is, we've heard so much about this idea of like eGov and all of that kind of thing leading up to this. Now it's like the DPI approach. Just very quickly, are there any differences? Are we talking about the same thing? Is the DPI approach, particularly using DPGs, is this a fundamental new way of thinking?
I mean, look, I hate to use the Shakespearean phrase, a rose by any other name. I really don't care as long as it is open, modular, interoperable. And to me, I think we're trying to call the same thing by different names. And I'm not gonna sort of stick my hat on a particular name. We've got to achieve the same thing no matter where in the world we are, no matter what we call it. And I think that if we stop, as Henri says, saying my solution is best, and try and find a way to say, look, these are all solutions that have the same common ideas. Let's find a way to make them work, because countries have built entire infrastructures on a particular solution. It's no point saying that that is a bad solution. You've got to find a way to make that work with whatever you've got, because we are now moving to a multi-stakeholder world where these systems have to work with each other. I do want to use UPI in Brazil the same way PIX is being used in Portugal, but I can't. I want to use UPI here in Norway, but I can't. We've got to now sort of stop worrying about which it is, as long as we can make them interoperable. Will be my thing. I just want to pick up on that last question, which was around the need for the internet. I don't want to ignore the statement that there is a large population that has been denied access to some of these miracles because they don't have the internet. But at the same time, I don't want that to be a reason for us to stop building DPIs until the whole world is connected, because we can't do that either. We have to push this out. I realized to my horror that there are parts of Canada that don't have 24/7 electricity. Now, electricity is a 100-year-old technology. And if we wait for every last person on the planet to be connected, whether Elon Musk does it from space or we do it on the ground, it's too late. What we have to do is to ensure that access to DPIs is not denied because of a lack of connectivity. And there are many ways to do that. We can build offline solutions. All we're saying is that this is a digital public infrastructure. We're not saying it's an internet-driven digital public infrastructure, though that's how it's delivered in a lot of places. We're saying lean into the power of digital. And then the way you access digital could be using the internet. It could be using QR codes. You can do what we call phygital, half physical, half digital. You can do online, offline. Many, many solutions. When India rolled out Aadhaar, we did not have internet in the entire country that we were reaching. Many people went out, enrolled people offline, came back to wherever they've got connectivity and uploaded it into the server. We still do that in a lot of different technologies. Africa should do it. There are parts of the world, even in the developed world, where you don't have wonderful connectivity. That does not mean you stop building our DPI, because we're not saying it is internet-driven. We're saying lean into digital.
On that note, I think we need to wrap it up. So thank you especially to our speakers, Desire, Rahul, Henri and Renata, for your insights here. What we're hearing is that despite these kind of like nuanced regional approaches, the things that really count are openness, interoperability, this ability to work together, build out your local vendor ecosystems, capacity development, all of those kind of things are important, and the importance of political will. Essentially, we have a shared ambition for this inclusive and interoperable DPI. Digital public goods are kind of coming through as a way to ensure that that is able to happen. And one of the things that came up in the Mentimeter was this idea of open source policies. I'm just going to plug a survey here that the Digital Public Goods Alliance, 24 members of the Alliance have put together this open source policies and practices survey. We would love everybody, as many people as possible, to be doing this. We're aiming to collect, even if you don't necessarily have an open source first policy, it's really useful to have your insights in this, and the learnings from that are going to enable other countries to learn from one another, organizations to learn from one another, and able to implement digital public goods. So I'll also just mention here, we will be having some actionable recommendations coming out of this policy for strengthening things like local capacity and agency in addition to the survey. We encourage you to continue to engage on...
Do we have to make your survey on a Google Doc? Really? Really?
I was hoping that wouldn't come up. Next time. And our rapporteur, Max, he's going to be synthesizing the key takeaways from this session. And we'll upload that to the IGF session page. Thanks for calling us out, Henri. And thank you again. we look forward to continuing this important work together. And wow, we ended slightly early. Thank you again so much.
I have a question for you.
Yes?